Well, welcome to the online lecture. I had to make an online lecture because we ran out of class time. So keep canceling our class like that, but I guess that's the way it goes. We'll do our best to cover the Mayan Popol Vuh, or creation story, through these three videos. That's what I've got planned, just a few minutes each. If you've read the texts, the handout and the text in the textbook, which is very brief, then you're ready to go. I'm going to give you a little background information here on the origin of the text. It's kind of an interesting story if you like this kind of thing, which I do. What we're talking about here is Mayan civilization. In the upper left-hand corner of this slide, you'll see where Mayan civilization was centered. That is the Yucatan Peninsula and parts of Central America. And the Mayan civilization thrived for several hundred years, about the time of Christ, all the way up to about 900 or 1000 AD. Its collapse, as we're going to say in just address in just a moment, was a big mystery why it happened. But we think there might be a pretty good theory as to why it happened. Several competing theories. Anyway, when the Spanish came, of course, with the conquistadors, came to the New World and placed much of what is today Latin America under their control. They imposed a number of different things: cultural things, language things, religious things, etc. And one of the things that's kind of an interesting sort of byproduct of that is that frequently, when a new power or dominant power comes into an area and takes over and sort of imposes its culture, not all of the previous culture goes away, as we know. And especially in Mayan civilization, the language still persisted. Many of the customs did. Many of the ways of life did, even though a lot did change. One of the things that you can find if you go to southern Mexico today is that, and Latin America and Central America today, is people still speak their indigenous languages to quite a bit of to quite an extent. It's kind of an unusual thing when someone says, well, I'm going to go and teach Spanish as a second language in Latin America. But indeed, in many parts of Latin America, you do have to do that because many people don't speak Spanish, or they speak a sort of hybrid between their indigenous language and Spanish. So a lot of things were sort of left over from that. Well, what we know about this particular text is that it is very old, very, very old indeed, probably somewhere around 1,500 years old if you want to go back that far. We don't really know. We know that the creation story by the Mayans was probably performed. It probably was done in the form of ritual, dance, and music in a public festival, and probably once a year, maybe every couple of years. We just don't know that. But we do know that it would have taken place in very, very large gatherings, and it would have been hundreds, thousands and thousands of people in big stadiums. And they had big stadiums as well as huge cities, very, very large cities. Some of their cities probably had well in excess of 50 to 100,000 human beings living there. And many of those cities are still being found as we speak. They were covered over by jungle, and so we're still every day through satellite imagery and whatnot finding out exactly how vast and extensive Mayan civilization was in the 800s and early 900s AD. The stories of the creation myth are quite unusual. We call them Popol Vuh. Popol Vuh means council book, and by council book, don't think of a traditional book. Think of a collection of maybe sort of silk screens or screens, maybe somewhere around 6 or 8 feet tall, we don't really know, by about 3 feet wide, or big panels. Panels made maybe out of paper or cloth that are painted, and these panels would have been arranged around a large stadium, and you might be able to go around and look at each panel one at a time, and maybe even the performance, this is all speculation, maybe even the performance is focused on one panel at a time until they made it all the way around the stadium with all the different dozens and dozens of panels, each of which may have told a story that was part of the creation myth. And so these big panels that existed were called the council books. That's kind of not really a book. Now, where are these ancient panels? Well, they're probably gone because everything from they were made of organic material that probably decayed, but also they were probably hidden or destroyed even by the Spanish when they came in and converted them to Catholicism. Probably got rid of these as pagan and such. However, what's interesting is this: in the 1550s, a monk who spoke Quiche, and by the way, the Mayans referred to their homeland as Quiche, okay, which means kind of like the center of the universe, right? So the Quiche people, rather than Mayan people, is what they would have referred to themselves as. A Quiche monk, probably. That's who we're talking about here, because it needed to be somebody who could read and write. at some point with at least some access to these big panels before they had been destroyed, lost, what have you, burned, who knows what, hidden, who knows what. Some monk with at least some access to this council book set of panels, to a limited extent, or maybe all of them, we don't know, transcribed all of the different stories of this collection known as the Popol Vuh into the Latin alphabet. He continued to use the Quiche language, but because it was hieroglyphic and not didn't have an alphabet, he used Western alphabet, Latin alphabet. Okay, so he's writing in Quiche or Mayan, the traditional Mayan stories that he's probably set down from at least some set of council books or recreation thereof. But he's writing it so that you could read it in alphabetic manner, right, in Western language. That is gone. We know that that is gone. But we get that story from a fellow named Father Jimenez, who was a missionary there in right at the beginning of the 18th century, 1701 or shortly thereafter. This Father Jimenez wrote down a translation of that original Quiche translation. Okay, so you got to follow the link here. We know it was probably a monk that was a convert to Catholicism, but who also wanted to preserve the stories maybe of his childhood. He wrote it in Quiche using Western alphabet. Father Jimenez in the 1700s, early 1700s, translates from Quiche to Spanish. But Father Jimenez's edition was lost. A reprint of Jimenez's edition was found in the 1850s and published in Europe, but it wasn't until 1941 that an original Father Jimenez version came to light from the Newberry Library. Why is all this important? Because it shows you sort of the DNA of this text. It started as council books. It was probably translated by some Quiche convert monk who used the Quiche language but also put it down in Latin alphabet. Then a fellow named Jimenez comes along and says, I'm going to take it from Quiche to Spanish, but it gets lost. And all we have is this kind of reprint from somebody else. And we don't know we never knew whether the reprint was reliable or not. But in 1941, we found the original Jimenez copy and were able to check it against later reprints. And sure enough, it was fairly accurate. So what we have in front of us is as accurate as possible, as long as we trust Father Jimenez to have set it down properly, a Spanish, now English, translation of the council books as recalled or recounted from one of the early converts, Mayan converts, probably a monk, because that's who would have been taught how to read and write. Your average Mayan would not have. Now that is a really interesting thing. It also is an interesting mystery involved here with the collapse of the Mayan civilization. Many people wondered whatever happened to the Mayan civilization. Why did it simply suddenly disappear? Was it warfare? Everybody was scared to live in the city, so they ran out into the jungles and disappeared. Was it disease? What was it? Well, come to find out, an amateur climatologist and archaeologist named Dick Gill, who used to be a vice president of a bank, believe it or not, here in Texas, quit his job, quit his profession, and studied archaeology all on his own, went down there many times and started looking at things from a different perspective. And one of those different perspectives was climatology. Now, you think, well, what in the world? It's a rainforest. I mean, the climate's always the same, isn't it? But what Dick Gill was able to do is he was able to say, what if what we've always thought about climate in rainforests isn't always true? What if it does change? What if it's not always constant? So what he looked at was weather patterns in that part of the world and found that every few hundred years, believe it or not, even though it's a rainforest, there's a drought. And that drought corresponds almost always with a very heavy, wet, cold winter, believe it or not, in Northern Europe. There's just something about the Gulf Stream and the way it shifts every few hundred years that causes wet, cold weather in Europe and simultaneously some sort of dry weather or lower than average precipitation in Central America. Then he went and looked at creek beds and he looked at lake beds and he measured the silt and he went down several feet into the silt and found that if you look at the layers of soil, you can tell a lot about the precipitation, because some of those layers will have a lot of decayed vegetation, some of it won't, which leads you to believe that in some years there was a lot of vegetation and therefore a lot of rainfall, and some years there weren't. There wasn't a lot of rainfall and therefore wasn't a lot of vegetation. What he put forward is a really fascinating theory that I think is the leading theory now, that, believe it or not, living in a rainforest, millions of Mayans who had become very dependent on living in cities and therefore using irrigation to irrigate their crops and city water and city sewage, during a drought in a rainforest, something that would have been totally unforeseen for these people, they wouldn't have lived through one before, they only come every few hundred years, suddenly it's enough to put enough pressure on crops and on freshwater supplies that the cities basically dry up, literally, and population plummets through starvation, through thirst, through bad sanitation, and the population disperses. This is a pretty good theory. It's an interesting theory. Don't know whether it'll hold up 20 years from now or not, but it's an interesting theory because Mr. Gill was A, an amateur banker from Texas, hooray, and B, because he decided to look at the problem the way a person in archaeology wouldn't typically look at it. He looked at it from sort of the underside of the box, or from the inside out, if you will, from a different perspective, which is fascinating. Again, like I said, the Popol Vuh is the Mayan creation story, and it's the story of life on Earth, mostly before humans. About 90% of the text is all about stories and things and events of gods and animals on Earth before humans got here. And so what you find is that pre-human, the world was a magical, mystical place where gods and goddesses walked around and inhabited the world, where spirits and the ancestral spirits of the gods and all of the animals spoke and interacted with one another, and where the laws of the universe weren't quite set yet. And so it's a fascinating thing. It gives us a distinctly different view of humanity as being not the center of creation, not the center of the universe, not the most important thing. And yet we get played out before us all kinds of human-like dramas and psychological events through the gods, through the animals, and so on. So we're going to take a look at a few of the big ones here. We're going to look first at the handout, because it's a little bit more detailed, and we'll look at some of the pre-human things, and then we'll look at the human creation story as well.